Welcome to the Ridgecrest podcast. This is where we take time each week to sit down for a deeper look into the previous Sunday's sermon. My name is Matt. I'm the executive and discipleship pastor here at Ridgecrest, and as always, I'm joined with our senior pastor, Michael Estes. Great to have you.
Good to be here.
Starting a brand new series.
Yeah.
We walked through first couple of chapters of Acts, and now we get to jump forward in time a bit. The letter of First Peter, as you mentioned, the sermon is kind of how we refer to it. And so we kind of get to start this journey, and you called the sermon series "Travelers on the Way," which I think is good because as we walk through First Peter over the next several weeks, it's really going to be a journey. We get to really travel through this letter and take it kind of slow, I guess, and just really dive in and I always like to do that with the letters of the New Testament because again they were written as such, and it was a very straightforward line of thinking. And so I think there's tremendous value in walking through that. So we're going to look at this over the next several weeks. So to get us started, I wanted us to kind of jump in to this idea of traveler. And, what do you think, whenever you kind of think along this line of, travelers on the way and being a traveler, throughout our reading of First Peter, how would you really define that, or what do you think it really means to be a traveler?
Well, first, I want to come back to something that we had a conversation after the service, you and me and Logan, about the way people travel. And I just wanted to take a second to see if our podcast listeners feel the same way. So I mentioned at the beginning of the sermon that Julie likes to drive when we go places, and I don't particularly care. I used to like to drive, but I don't really care for it anymore. There's part of it's because I'm old and I can't see at night. But like, you and Logan were surprised by this, and I was curious as to why that is and whether or not you think that's the norm. Yeah,
well, I was probably a little less surprised than Logan because I've seen that there's a cultural shift that's happening, and it's interesting because I have a very good friend of mine where he and his wife always drives, like no matter what, they always do that, and so that was very new to me because growing up, of course, my parents were divorced, so it was a little different. But whenever they remarried, and if Dad was in the vehicle with like my stepmom or whatever, Dad would drive,
right?
And so that's what I always knew. And then I had this friend who all of a sudden now she's the one driving. Like, wait a second, isn't this opposite? And then now there are a lot of people who drive, and I'm gonna point over here to Stephen for just a second, or hard at work AV guy. And he's pressing all sorts of buttons. So we'll see if this works. As far as driving, is that like whenever you and Anna go on a trip, is that something that you drive, or does Anna drive?
We usually take her car.
Okay.
Because I don't trust my truck. So she does most of the driving on trips.
There you go.
Okay. So for those of you who are unable to hear, Anna handles the driving because they take her car, and so most trips that's the more reliable option. So she drives that, and so yeah, I do think it is becoming more of a cultural norm, which I think is okay. It's
sure,
it's perfectly fine. It's just different, and of course Logan was kind of surprised in that regard. But what stood out to me was I was in the first service, and I don't know if you said it the same way in the second or not, but in the first service, you were talking about, it was early in the morning. You were driving in the car, doing all these little back roads, and then Julie says, you should just take a nap. And you're like, well, I can't take a nap. So it kind of threw me for a loop because I was like, wait a second. Of course he can't take a nap because he's driving, because that was kind of how I immediately kind of perceived it. And I was like, wait a second. No, she must have been driving so that he did have the opportunity at least to take a nap. But
I could have, but I have control issues, and I want, if I'm a navigator, I want to make sure my driver knows where they need to go. And so, anyways, that gets to the whole question of what does it mean to live as a traveler.
Yeah.
And I think a huge part of living as a traveler means that there is purpose to the traveling, right? We don't just wander around from place to place, but we're moving somewhere. When I go on vacation, there's an end goal, there's a destination that we're headed toward. And so in the same way as we think about living as followers of Jesus Christ, we're not just aimlessly wandering through life. And that, I think sometimes we fall into that trap where we get into the day-to-day and the ordinary and the mundane, and we think to ourselves, well, there's no real purpose to this day. But that's one of the things that we need to reshape the way we think about that and think to ourselves, man, there's purpose in this. I'm going somewhere. Every decision that I make, every habit that I form is moving me in a direction and is shaping the direction that I'm going to go in. And is it going to be the type of direction that's going to lead me closer to my ultimate destination, or is it going to be something that's going to make me meander and wander and make it harder to get to that destination? As we traveled to Arkansas, one of the things that was really kind of tricky is that you had to make sure you hit the right back roads, because sometimes back roads, there was no other way. So like if you started going down the wrong path, you're going to be on that path for a while. And in the same way as followers of Jesus, if we start wandering down the wrong paths, there's no guarantee that we're going to get off that path for a while. We may have to deal with a lot of different things as we go the wrong way. And so it's important for us to figure out ways that we can live in accordance with that path that we're called to. And I talked a little bit about the idea of obedience and how that is in some ways kind of contrary to our culture's understanding of authority in their life. A lot of us want to be autonomous, right? We want to have control of our situation. And so to submit to somebody else's authority and say, I'm going to live the way you think I should, is foreign to the way we think. But in Scripture, it's the way. It is the only way to live a life that's full of flourishing and thriving, is by obedience to the Father through the Son Jesus. And so anyways, and that's another thing about traveling too, is you think about roads that get us places, or if you're flying in an airplane, and you know about these sorts of things, you can't just decide, I'm going to take this route to go, because that route may end up ultimately leading you in a completely wrong direction, or may get you in the line of places that other people are trying to travel. Air traffic, I know, is that way, is those planes have to go a very specific way, because unless they're otherwise directed to change course, because there are other planes in the air going places. And so there's all kinds of stuff, as we think about living as a traveler, there is a direction for us that we should follow, and it helps us to get to the place that we're trying to go. Yeah.
And a lot of times, while you kind of go along those lines and you know this destination that you're getting to, there are times when you travel, and the journey is a little bit different. Mm-hmm. Where, for me, when I travel, typically I'm very straightforward. This is the destination we're going to. I want to get there as fast as I possibly can.
Right.
But then there are other times, less likely in my case, because it can, kind of like you were, it forces me to, get out of that, and I like to plan and know what I'm doing. But there are some individuals who just love to say, this is where we're going, but on the way, we're going to see and do as much as we can until we get there. And so again, that's not wandering off course,
right,
but it's understanding what that kind of mission is and exactly, what it is you're working towards. And so
Sure.
I think that's a great example. Same thing with flying. If I want to go from point A to point B, sometimes the best way to get from point A to point B is to really make that destination point C and stop somewhere else along the way to avoid, a large airport, so I don't have to get hung up with where the air traffic controller is telling me to, fly this heading, this heading, this heading, this heading, until I get out of their airspace, which could add, a lot of time
Sure.
to my trip. And so sometimes taking that kind of side, path sometimes can lead us back. But again, it's not, as you said, it's not just wandering aimlessly. It's
right.
having intent and having purpose.
Yep.
And making the most of this journey that we're on.
Yeah, for sure.
And you talked about really in this context, the journey, this travelers on the way, again, you mentioned the way being Jesus, we have this idea of, we know what the destination is, and of course there in 1 Peter, it speaks of that inheritance and that, inheritance of salvation and that sort of thing. And you specifically brought attention to the passage where it kind of revealed that, we're called to live in our unending, undefiled, and unfading inheritance.
Yeah.
And you really spent some time looking at the security of that inheritance, and which I think is a tremendous part of our faith, is knowing that we are secure in that. And again, you bring up the point that, God, and his army is defending that, and it's a pretty strong stance. And so I kind of say all that to ask the question, how does knowing the secure nature of our inheritance affect the journey?
Yeah, it's to continue to use the travel analogy. If my family decides we're going to go to Memphis for the weekend, knowing that the location of Memphis isn't going to change as we travel is very important, right? Like it makes my journey a lot less certain if, as we leave, we find out that Memphis is no longer north of us; it's south of us. In fact, it's southeast, and it's got to cross an ocean now. And I didn't know any of those things happened before. And so, if I know ultimately this is the place that we're headed, then detours and difficulties along the way, traffic, those sorts of things become less of a problem and more of this is just a part of the deal. This is a part of the journey. This is a part of the experience. And I think about, walking in faith, this idea that Jesus has secured my inheritance. The Father is the one protecting it. I don't have to be afraid that anything's going to change that. It gives me freedom to live life in a way that is not just I'm getting by day by day. It is a thriving kind of life. It's an abundant kind of life. And I think so often as believers we miss out on this. We live that I'm surviving kind of life. Like I'm just getting by. I'm trying not to mess everything up and to fall off the path and those sort of things. Instead of I am enjoying every moment of this. This is all a gift. I get to enjoy every second. It doesn't mean that it's always fun, but ultimately I can, like he says later on, rejoice in these things. And so I think, and that makes a difference to our witness.
Yeah.
Right? Like if I am simply just barely getting by, if I'm surviving all the time, survival mode, my witness looks way different. I go back to my teaching days, and I remember my first couple of years, I was in survival mode. And I know that directly impacted the way my students viewed my teaching. But once I got to a point to where, like, I know where I'm going, like I know what's going to happen, I have a pretty clear picture of how we're going to get there. All of a sudden, my teaching was infused with enthusiasm and joy, and my students received it so much better. In the same way as believers, if we allow the fact that there's this reality that's undergirding all that we're doing, that's going to be unchangeable and it's not going to die and it's not going to fade over time. It is something that is secure, that I'm looking for and I'm going toward. Then all this stuff along the way, like it can be infused with things like joy and peace and hope and love. And those things aren't based in survival; they're based in thriving and flourishing.
Yeah.
And that just looks way different to the world.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of what the witness as believers right now is maybe missing, right? Like the way we respond to, to make this relevant, the way we respond to political events in our life. Whoever you choose to vote for in November, if at the end of that person doesn't win, and we as believers respond with despair, or frustration, or anger, that affects our witness to the world outside. It means that we've placed our hope in something that we knew wasn't really secure. But if we get to the end of that and the person that we wanted to win doesn't win, and we still can go through life and know, hey, I can still have peace. It doesn't matter what's going to happen tomorrow after this election's over. I can still have joy. I can still enjoy my life that God has given me and use it in a way that honors Him. Nothing that's happening in history is going to affect or change that. Then all of a sudden that just says amazing things about who God is, and it speaks very clearly about, it says something about our witness as believers. If you go through Acts, you see that over and over and over again. These folks were not focused on an earthly home. They were focused on this eternal inheritance that they were given, and they went out and changed the world because of it. They weren't worried about earthly success anymore, or thriving in the sense that everything on earth was going the way they wanted to. They were focused on this is the end goal, and this is what I'm looking forward to.
Yeah. And as you were talking there and kind of continue to use that travel metaphor, or illustration, it was really good because I was kind of thinking, there is tremendous value in knowing this is where I'm going. I'm not going to veer from that, and I know the direction I'm going towards. But on the flip side of that, I think we also, again, going back to traveling, imagery, whenever we travel, sometimes we get so excited about where we're going, we can easily, get in that mindset of, oh, well, I just wish I was there. Of course, I know whenever I've done long trips, I wish I could just teleport and be there. We have those kinds of conversations. But truth of the matter is it doesn't work that way. And so to get there, we still have to go along this journey, and we still have to take the long car ride. We still have to, stop for food. We still have to do all these, get caught in traffic, all these things. But as you mentioned, knowing what that destination is makes all those things worth it. And so I think there's tremendous value in that, and because a lot of times we can just think of, well, this is where I'm going. Great, I'll get there. So I can just sit back and relax because eventually, I'll get there. But in actuality, it does take a little bit of effort on our part to do what God has called us to on that journey.
And there's a lot of joy in that effort.
Yeah.
I think about family trips that my family has gone on, and like some of my favorite memories and moments, I look back at pictures and stuff like that and remember these things, have come from the trip, not from the actual, we got to the place and we did the things, but like going there, like some of the funny things that happen along the way, some of the jokes that we make, some of the places that we stop and eat, or like there are those experiences that, and I know we're going to come back to this in just a minute, that really, like, if you're just focused on the end, you miss all those things in between that are really valuable and meaningful and shaping you in ways that are really kind of important.
Yeah. And whenever I was growing up, I was probably early middle school, because I'm thinking my younger brother and sister were they're twins, and I think they were probably 2 years or so at the time. We rented a van. We also had grandparents, going with us, kind of doing a family trip to the beach, and rented a van. Well, we get there, on the trip, the air conditioning goes out. And it's, hot, summer trip to the beach. And so it, AC went out, so it was already kind of a miserable trip. Then we get maybe an hour and a half or so from the beach, get a flat tire. And again, we have probably 2-year-old twins, with us, and grandparents, and just
all kinds of joy.
Very much full of joy along the journey on that one. But eventually, it all gets worked out, and I can't remember exactly. I guess we probably eventually made it to the beach, and maybe they end up getting us a different rental car or whatever it might be. I can't remember exactly, but I just remember the suffering that took place. And so, along those lines, while that's kind of a in our minds, kind of a silly illustration as far as what suffering is. You talked about suffering as a way of it refining our faith. And so here you mentioned, under the context of what Peter wrote this letter, that their suffering was very different than what our suffering is, and under a ruler that was very he was just evil, just a very strong individual. And so I say all that to say, is there a specific type of suffering that refines our faith? Is it just the context that Peter's writing, and us facing persecution, or is it some other things that, again, in our minds we may minimalize or things like that? How would you really define, or say, is there a specific type of suffering that refines our faith?
Yeah. So Peter is going to refine the word suffering. He's going to be a little bit more detailed later on, but he's really wide open when it comes to suffering in this particular. He just says various trials, which various gives us kind of all kinds of options when it comes to that type of suffering. Later on in chapter 3, he's going to talk about suffering for righteousness' sake, and how that's a specific type of suffering that can refine us and make us more genuine in our faith. I think that anything outside of that can be used for that purpose, that God can use any kind of suffering to refine us, to make us stronger, to prepare us for what he would have for us. And the reason I say that is, if you go into John, and I referenced this, and I can't remember if I referenced it in both sermons or not, but John 16:33, it's one of those that God has really just lodged in my brain and made a part of my walk with him. He says, Jesus says this, I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation. You'll have trouble. You'll have difficulties. You'll have suffering. It's a promise. But take heart, I have overcome the world. And so I don't know that there's a specific type of suffering that the Bible has in view when it comes to stuff that can refine our faith. Because, look, if you look throughout the story of Scripture, there's all kinds of suffering that takes place. Job suffers as a righteous person, and his suffering was all-encompassing, right? Like, it wasn't just him individually, his health. It was his family. It was his wealth. Everything was taken away from him. Then you go into other places in the scriptures, and you'll see that other people suffer specific things, either because the world is evil and fallen, or because of decisions that they had made. In either case, that suffering can be used to refine faith. Some is more painful than other, right? Like when I make decisions that ultimately results in suffering because I was a fool. I did something that was, foolish in my life, and I experienced the consequences of that. That's far less easy to deal with than there's just stuff that happens because the world's evil or it's fallen or it's broken, and God can use that to refine us. You think about Joseph in Genesis, right? He goes through all of these different things because his brothers plotted against him, and part of that was kind of his fault because he was bragging, and part of it was the fact that they were sinful and they chose to act in a sinful way, and it had specific consequences for him and his family. And it wasn't just Joseph that suffered; it was the entire family that suffered. And Joseph gets to the end of that, and he's like, you meant these things for evil. He's talking to his brothers, but God used it for good. And it can be easy for us, and this is the part that I want to be really clear about, because I did say that suffering is legitimized by the Bible. Like, it is real. The Bible does not say to reject it or to say to yourself, it's not real. It shouldn't bother you that much. Just seek happiness and you'll be fine. Ignore your suffering, this sort of thing. The Bible doesn't say that. The Bible says suffering is a real thing. But a lot of times we can't see what it's doing to us until we get to that point of retrospect, right? So it's after the fact that we realize, there was all these things in me that I needed to have taken away. And now that they've been taken away, my faith is stronger. It's deeper. It's more secure. It's more able to withstand and durable. And so, I don't know that there's a specific type. He's going to talk about suffering for righteousness' sake, but I think suffering can be generalized in the Scripture as any kind of suffering. And the truth of the matter is, God's peace has been given to us through it, and we can take heart because Jesus has overcome it.
Yeah. And as you mentioned, we live in a fallen world. You're very clear in that in the sermon, and part of living in that fallen world is suffering. Whether, like you said, whether that is for righteousness' sake, or if it's other areas of suffering, whether it be physical or emotional, or that there are different kinds of suffering, and the Scripture tells us that God works all things together for His good. And so I have to believe that, whatever type of perceived suffering we are going through, God can use that, and we can, our faith can be refined through that, perhaps. And so, along those same lines, this idea of our faith being refined, what are some characteristics of that refined faith that we really should be looking towards? That way, when we are in the midst of suffering, as you said, sometimes we can't really tell that we were refined until we get to the other side of it. But what are some things we should kind of start looking for, whether we're maybe coming out of that suffering or maybe in the midst of it, or some things that we can really just think and pray on and just seek God to be doing in our lives? Yeah,
the one characteristic that Peter brings up is genuineness. In other words, like there's a realness, there's an authenticity to our faith as it's being tested. We understand what's real and what has kind of been a facade for us, and those sorts of things. Those kind of misconceptions on our part, or those things that that we tried to hold up as our strength and that sort of thing, those things are taken away, and we can no longer kind of like pretend like those things are real. We have a genuine faith, and that's one characteristic. Paul kind of gets into it. In chapter 5 of Romans, in verse 3, he says, because he's talking about this idea that we're going to suffer as believers, and this is what he says: not only that, but we rejoice in our sufferings. Does that sound familiar to what Peter said? It's exactly what Peter says. We rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. So that's one thing that we can look for, is this fact that we can go through things and know that because of the strengthening of God, we can make it through these things, right? So suffering produces endurance. Endurance produces character. In other words, we become more real. I think about the word character in terms of kind of like literary things. A character who is not a well-developed character in a book, you look at him and you're like, I don't believe that. That person's not believable as a person. But those characters that are well developed, that you can see them go through things and you understand, like, I get who this person is.
Yeah.
That's the same idea here. Is it gives us a realness. It goes back to that genuineness. It gives us this reality of who we actually are. So produces character. Character produces hope. So one of the things that it does when we suffer is it gets rid of all those false hopes that we may have had. Those dead hopes is what I called them in the sermon. It gets rid of all those things, and we have this living hope that we can hold on to. So it produces hope, and hope does not put us to shame. So there's now a lack of shame on our part. We can live in a way that's not shameful. We can live with a lack of guilt. We can enjoy the faith that we have. And he goes on, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. And so Paul kind of links all those things. There's other places that you can look at. James 1 talks about suffering and talks about how it does some of these same things, right? It produces in us things like perseverance and love and this quality of faith that wasn't there before. And so there are things being done. But again, I will say this, and I'll say this with absolute sincerity, you're not going to maybe experience that in that moment. Like, you're going to have to get to the other side of that sometimes to actually enjoy the benefits of the byproducts that are produced in this.
Yeah.
So when you're going through suffering, you may not feel to yourself like you're being built up in endurance. But the same thing's true when you exercise, right?
Right.
You go through things and exercise and you're like, this is miserable. I don't feel like I'm getting stronger. I don't feel like I'm getting better. I think about my baseball boys. Coaching them. I had them practice outside twice last week. It was hot. Well, we have a tournament coming up soon, and I want them to be prepared for heat. And so I wanted them to endure through that heat. In that moment, they probably were not like, I feel like I'm getting stronger right now.
Yeah.
But my hope is we get to the tournament weekend, and all of a sudden, like, that heat, they've been sitting out in it. They know what it's like, and they're just like, this is normal. I can deal with this. But they don't know that in that moment. They know that in retrospect, as they experience the success or the being able to get through. You don't know that till afterwards. And so I want people to understand that it's not to say that, man, it just means that we just look forward to suffering and it's just going to be unicorns and butterflies and everybody's going to be happy while we go. It's going to be difficult.
Yeah.
But it's producing something good in us.
Yeah. Yeah. That's good, and I would also add, along those same lines, anyone who's listening, to the podcast, if you're interacting with someone and ministering to someone who is in the midst of that suffering, be very careful. A lot of times we want to jump to that end and say it's okay. You're being refined. You're growing in character.
Yeah.
You're growing in all these different areas. You're going to be okay. But if someone is in the middle of the grief process, they don't feel like it's okay.
Yeah.
And if they're right in the middle of the suffering, you can give these words, and while these words may be true, they're just not the best thing to say in that moment. And so I would just encourage individuals, as you interact with people who are in the midst of suffering, is, we talk about empathy a lot, and empathize, don't try to compare or say, oh, well, you'll be okay because I went through this,
right.
Similar situation. And, of course, we hear, the term emotional intelligence, and that's kind of what comes to mind here. But just be mindful of the situation, and the greatest thing we can do is to pray for them and let them know that we're there to support them and encourage them and provide any help that we might be able to do in the midst of that suffering. But the last thing we need to do is try to just project and say, oh, it's okay, because in that moment, it doesn't feel okay, and it's going to be hard for them to see that, and sometimes some animosity and things could even be built up there.
Sure.
So I just
not just against you, but against the church and
Sure.
against Christian faith. And I would agree with what you say. This is where what we believe really affects the way we behave. Jesus didn't stand up in heaven and point down at us and say, you need to deal with your sin. You need to. I see that you're sinners. What do you do? He came down and he walked with us. Incarnational theology is important. And so as we think about helping people deal with suffering, it's just our presence sometimes that needs to be there. Like, we just need to be there for them.
Yeah.
It's not that we need to say anything. Look back to Job. Job's friends were terrible.
Absolutely.
He had bad friends. They tried to legitimize. They basically were like, you're suffering because of this, and this is what's going to happen. And finally, somebody shows up and they're like, no, y'all need to stop talking. We just need to be here.
Yeah.
We just need to sit with Joe for a while and not say anything.
Yeah.
And that's what I agree completely with what you're saying is it's important for us in those moments not to try to be God for them, but to be the presence that they may need, the hands and the feet of Jesus that they may need in that moment. And they'll talk when they're ready, and they'll work those things
Sure.
out loud when they're ready. But it may be a while before they're ready.
Yeah, that's good. And as we kind of wrap up, I was wondering if maybe you could share, if you have like a specific story of suffering that you may have went through and your faith was kind of refined through that, and now again being on this side of that, how you were able to see kind of God working in that.
Yeah, so I've shared with our congregation, and I've shared on the podcast that I went through a period about 10 years ago of significant depression. And it was related to a lot of different things. Part of it was behavior on my part. Part of it was just kind of the circumstances of life. And it was to the point that, I needed medical help to work my way through it. And I'm not ashamed of any of that. That's just a part of my story because God ultimately used it to help. I mean, the reality of being tested by fire and the impurities that were brought out of me through that that statement is real to me because in reality there was a lot in my life that needed to be weeded out, needed to be burned away, and God used that time to really teach me and to really in those moments kill those false hopes. And I mean, when I say kill, I mean like it felt like that. It felt very painful. But the truth of the matter is all of that pain led me somewhere, and it led me to reject false hopes and to put real hope, real trust in Jesus and not, in these idols that I created for myself. And sometimes I find myself slipping back and forth into that, but the truth is now, because of what God has brought me through, I do understand what endurance is. I do understand what character is. I do understand what real hope is. And I probably didn't have a very clear understanding of those things before that. And that doesn't mean that, and I say this to people who do struggle with mental illness and, those sorts of things, that, I understand in those moments it's bad. It is unpleasant. And you feel like there's no way out of it. And it may be a long time before you do get out of it. But I say that to say that endure. As painful as it is, endure. Find somebody to walk with you through it. That's what thankfully I had some people come alongside me, and they didn't do what we were talking about a second ago. They didn't say, well, if you just pray some more, then you'll feel better. If you just, that's important. Obviously you should pray.
Yeah.
But they walked with me through it. They talked to me. They confronted me with truth when I needed it. And then there were other times where they just were like, I know this is difficult right now. You just hang in there, and I'm going to be here with you while you go through it. And that made a huge difference in my life. And God has used it not just to minister to me, but to also to be able to minister to other people. I've had people come up to me after I've shared my story and say, I'm going through the same thing. Can you walk with me through this? And of course, my answer is yes, because God walked me through this, and I want to help others, walk through that as well. And so, yeah, I definitely have experienced something like that, and painful in the moment, but in the long run, it was what was best.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks for sharing that. Mm-hmm. And as always, if you have any additional questions, or maybe you're in the midst of suffering, or you're just trying to figure out what it means to be a traveler along this journey, and what it means to be following Jesus, and of course working towards this inheritance of salvation that we're talking about, but trying to figure out what your role is on this journey, reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk through that and help you process that, because again, we all are travelers, and it is as we work through 1 Peter, we get to see the journey of some of those early individuals who followed Jesus, and get to be encouraged by someone who walked with Jesus and experienced their own suffering, as you referred to in the sermon. This is an individual who he betrayed Jesus, and not betrayal as in Judas, but betrayed him as far as denying him. And you see someone like that, and then you get to this point, and you see the significant shift that happened in his life, and the same shift can happen in our life. And so if that's you, and just trying to figure out your place in this journey, reach out to us. We'd be happy to talk with you through that and help process what it means to be a traveler on the way. As we're following Jesus and as we're working towards that inheritance, we're making the most of that journey along the way. We're making disciples and passionately pouring in to those around us so that we can see others come to know God, serve Him, as well as reach our world as well. So as always, we appreciate you listening. We hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next time.